What if one of the most important systems on the Titanic almost didn't work at all? Just hours before the ship struck the iceberg, its wireless radio, the only way to call for help, completely broke down. And the story of how it was repaired may have changed everything that followed. When people think about the Titanic, they usually focus on the iceberg, the lifeboats, or the tragedy itself. But behind the scenes, in a small room filled with buzzing electrical equipment, two radio operators were fighting a different kind of crisis, one that most passengers never knew about. As the Titanic steamed towards the iceberg that would seal her fate, the wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were busy repairing the wireless equipment in the silent room. But what if Jack and Harold never performed these repairs on the evening of April 13th and the early morning hours of April 14th? Would the passengers and crew been saved at all, or would a backup system have been strong enough to send the CQD? The Marconi Room aboard the Titanic and Olympic was split up into three separate rooms: the silent room, the operator's cabin, and the sleeping quarters. The silent room consisted of three components: the main transmitter, which generated high-power radio waves for long-distance communication; the motor generator set converted the ship's electrical supply into the high voltage needed; and the emergency battery supply, a limited supply backup power source, not a full duplicate system. There was one primary transmitter. If a critical component fails, as it did before the collision, operators had to repair it manually. There was no switchover system. The battery system could power reduced operations. Range and signal strength were significantly limited compared to the main generator. It was intended for short-term emergency use, not continuous operation. During the sinking, as long as the ship's power held, the system operated at near full capacity. When power began failing on the ship, signals became weaker and intermittent. Operators likely transitioned toward battery-supported transmission, and eventually all power was lost, equaling radio silence. On April 13, 1912, the Titanic's Marconi wireless system failed. This wasn't just a minor glitch. It was a major electrical breakdown. The transmitter, which allowed long-distance communication, stopped working altogether. At the time, wireless communication was considered cutting-edge technology. The ship depended on it for navigation updates, passenger messages, and emergency contact. Without it, the Titanic was effectively cut off from the outside world. The proper procedure was wait until the ship docked in New York and for a certified Marconi technician to come out and perform the repairs. But in this instance, Jack and Harold did not wait and decided to try to repair the equipment themselves, which turned out to be the right decision in the end. As Jack and Harold dug deeper into the equipment, they didn't find any issues. They started looking at the transformer, which has tightly wound copper wires around the core to help convert power from DC to AC, which was mainly produced from the main generators at 100 volts. The reason for this change from DC to AC is that the Titanic used an alternating current signal to broadcast a wireless signal. With AC, it allowed for a wider transmission area of up to 1,000 miles, unlike the DC system, which could transmit for roughly only about 100 to 200 miles, depending on various factors. So what went wrong with the transformer? Throughout the 3 days at sea on her maiden voyage, the transformer that supplied power to the spark gap wireless telegraph, which operated at 1,500 watts, had a winding on the secondary coil come loose, and it made contact with the steel casing. For hours, Phillips and Bride worked inside the cramped radio room. They dismantled components, improvised solutions, and pushed the equipment to its limits. Eventually, against the odds, they got it working again. By the evening of April 14th, the system was back online, but the success came with an unintended consequence. While the radio had been down, messages had piled up. Passengers were sending paid telegrams called Marconi grams to friends, family, and business contacts. Now that the system was working again, Phillips focused on clearing the backlog. Message after message he transmitted non-stop. Meanwhile, other ships were trying to warn the Titanic about ice in the area. Several ice warnings came in that day, but because Phillips was so busy, some messages were delayed or interrupted. At one point, a nearby ship tried to send a warning, but was cut off with a sharp response, "Shut up, I am busy." That message might have carried critical information about the ice field Titanic was heading into. Later that night, Titanic struck the iceberg, and suddenly the repaired wireless system became the most important piece of equipment on the ship. Phillips and Bride went back to work. This time, Phillips sending real distress traffic while Bride alternated between the main and emergency generators. Shortly after the collision, around 12:15 a.m., the first calls went out. MGY was Titanic's wireless call sign. Minutes later, Bride suggested trying the newer signal. "Send SOS, it's a new call, and it may be our last chance to send it," he said. So Phillips began alternating. Approximately 12:25 to 12:30 a.m., updated urgency followed. Ships across the North Atlantic picked up the fragments, some strong, others barely readable through interference. At around 12:45 a.m., signals indicated worsening conditions. The Carpathia acknowledged and began racing toward the coordinates. By roughly 1:20 to 1:40 a.m., transmissions became weaker, but continued. Even as the ship listed and power fluctuated, Phillips stayed at the key. The final node transmission, sometime around 2 to 2:10 a.m., faded into static. Moments later, the wireless went silent. Those last signals, sent in the final minutes, were the difference between rescue and complete isolation. So what if the wireless system had never been fixed? First, the Titanic would have been completely isolated. No incoming ice warnings at all, meaning the crew might have had even less awareness of the danger ahead. But the biggest consequence comes after the collision. Without a working radio, there would have been no distress signals, no CQD, no SOS. Nearby ships, including the Carpathia, would have had no idea the Titanic was sinking. Rescue efforts would have been delayed by hours, or might not have happened at all. In that scenario, the number of survivors could have dropped dramatically. The lifeboats that were launched could have been left alone in the freezing Atlantic, with no rescue ships coming to find them in time. In the final moments, the ship lost electrical power, lights went out, and the wireless died completely. The bow was already deep underwater. The stern began lifting sharply into the air. Structural stress likely caused the ship to break apart. Modern evidence supports a breakup between the bow and the stern. At around 2:20 a.m., the Titanic fully disappeared beneath the surface. It won't. Jack Phillips stayed at his post until the end and did not survive. Harold Bride survived by clinging to an overturned lifeboat. Following the sinking, there were multiple regulations. Ships were required to maintain a 24-hour radio watch. Improved redundancy and emergency power systems became standard. International regulations, like those from the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, formalized these requirements. In the end, it wasn't just the iceberg that sealed Titanic's fate. It was timing, technology, and a fragile system that almost failed when it mattered most. Sometimes history doesn't turn on a single moment, but on whether something gets fixed just in time. And in Titanic's case, that repair didn't just change the story. It decided who lived long enough to tell it.